Welcome to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast, powered by the Snowbird US Day Tracker app. I'm your host, Gerry Scott, and my goal is to give you answers to your cross-border questions, to ease the stress of a cross-border move or extended trip, and to keep you up to date on all you need to know with cross-border rules and regulations. Now let's get on with the show. Well, welcome everybody to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast. I'm really excited about today's guest. A little bit about our guest, Alex Doulis, wrote a book in the mid-90s. And Alex, you can correct me on all if I was wrong, but I remember getting this book in my hands in 1996. So I think the book was published maybe around 94. But it was a very interesting book. It was called Take Your Money and Run. And basically what Alex did was I believe he was in his early 50s. Him and his lovely bride decided we're going to take our money and leave and exit Canada. I believe you became a citizen of Dublin, Ireland, and you sailed around the world for the next 15 years and eventually made your way back. Now, the reason why I've asked Alex to be back on the podcast is because of all this turmoil and chaos we have between the United States and Canada right now. And if Alex was to rewrite his book, would it be entitled, Take Your Money and Come Home? So Alex, welcome to the podcast again. I'm indebted. Welcome.
It's good to be here. You're on talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is, again, people being able to keep as much of their wealth and their earnings as possible. And one of the things I noticed, Gerry, was that, like many people, you confuse expats with snowbirds. Snowbirds remain residents of Canada, but often acquire properties in the U.S. For summer homes, which they can, or basically winter homes because it's summer down there. But basically, they can only stay there 179 days a year. Otherwise, if they stay longer than that, they will be declared residents of the United States for tax purposes. Expats are those individuals who actually flee. What they do is they take their money and they run. And what they do is they give up their Canadian residency and become residents someplace else, usually in a tax-friendly environment. I chose Ireland because Ireland has income tax on all of your income earned in Ireland, but not on income that is earned by you outside of Ireland. Now, Gerry, you understand why all these companies are moving their headquarters to Ireland. So anyway, what happens is the expat actually moves all of his assets out of Canada into usually a tax haven environment. He himself goes to a tax-friendly environment because no matter what, he's going to have some kind of income to be able to survive. And the one that is really bulletproof is the expat. Because if you are still a citizen of Canada, you've got all the protections of a citizen of Canada. But if you're not a resident of Canada, you have none of the liabilities or responsibilities of a Canadian resident as far as taxes, nor do you have any of the benefits. So, as you saw in the book, you replace all of what Canada was giving you with something that you have purchased abroad. But as things are going now, there is a class of people who remain Canadian residents and have a place in the U.S., which they go as snowbirds. There is as well a group of Americans who move, or Canadians who move permanently to the United States and become tax liable there. But when they do that, they do it on the basis of take your money and run, in that they have put all of their earnings and assets outside of Canada and the U.S. So what they have is a minimal income in the United States upon which they're liable. But you mentioned a very interesting thing. I'm not sure if you caught two items in this morning's mail or news. One was that 54% of snowbirds are thinking or have listed their U.S. properties for sale. Another thing that was in the news today was that Denmark has criticized the United States taking coercive, or yes, not coercive, what is it? Secret undertakings in Greenland. You brought up, how should people feel about either being in the United States or having their assets in the United States? First thing, Gerry, is uncertainty. If there's one thing an investor can't stand, it's uncertainty. If there's one thing an individual can't adapt to, it's uncertainty. When you're I was a geologist. When you're walking down a bush trail, one of the things that you don't want as an uncertainty is a bear at the other end of the trail. And now we have a bear at the end of the trail, which actually may be a monkey. Let's look at what's happened. He imposed a general sales tax on all of the people of the United States, a GST. The tariffs are a GST on the people of the United States on everything that they buy, which is foreign. That GST has produced $16 billion a month for the U.S. Treasury. That GST is increasing the price of American products. So people living in the United States, when they go to buy a can of Coors next week, they're going to find that their can of Coors now costs 10 cents more because the aluminum which is going into the cans is more expensive. And Coors is going to pass that on to the consumer. So what you have here is the uncertainty of inflation coming into the American economy. So either snowbirds or people who have taken residency in the United States are facing that uncertainty. As well, would you, Gerry, move to a country that has armed troops on the street? Can you imagine that? How would you feel as a non-resident, or pardon me, a non-citizen of the United States residing in the United States when they are taking people who have come into the United States, putting them in internment camps and then sending them abroad? How do you know that's not going to be applied to you? So there is all of this uncertainty, which, according to the real estate figures released this morning, are very definitely affecting Canadians who are living in the U.S. Now, one thing I should mention is there are a lot of people who have become expats, and I don't hear about them putting up their properties in the Barbados, in Italy, wherever.
You know, Alex, it's interesting as we were asked to be part of an article that was written a couple weeks ago. Maybe, I guess we're going back 2 months ago. And I believe that demographically, I think there's we'll use Maui as an example where I'm very familiar with. The generation before us, if the parents owned it, that generation, those kids were able to acquire that property with a sibling, cover the expenses, and they shared the place equally. They lived in Vancouver and they would go to Maui. Well, now now it seems like this generation, they want the money. They don't want to pay the property taxes. They don't want to pay the insurance costs, which have escalated in places like Maui, Palm Springs, Florida, etc. So, but if there's anything pushing people over the edge to sell their places, you've nailed it. These Canadians, the snowbirds, are selling their places. It's alarming. And I think the developers in Canada here are trying to capitalize all that money coming home, well, why don't you buy a place in Qualicum? Beautiful place on Vancouver Island. Yeah, they get rain. They don't get a lot of snow. They don't get a lot of sunshine in the wintertime. But it's a very friendly, well, it's Canada, you know it. Um, it's alarming. It's interesting. But when we talk about these Canadians that have moved to the States, have worked there for the last 30, 40 years, they have their green cards. They never went for their citizenship. We're seeing on the wealth management side, these families are coming home. They're probably coming home maybe 5 years earlier than if they were to retire and stay in the States. So it's interesting. But here's a question for you. This wonderful book that I've read, I've given it out to clients and friends that were a little bothered by Canada over the last decade and said they want to take their money and run. If you had to write that book today, would all those rules, or do you think it's still popular for these Canadians to run, take their money and become a citizen of places like Ireland or, Denmark? My wife and I were in Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, and those are beautiful countries. Are you finding that if you wrote that book today, it would be as popular as it was in the 90s?
Well, first, let me correct you. They go to places like wherever. They don't become citizens there. They become residents. And the rule put up by CRA is you are resident in the last place you resided. So although I never spent another day in Ireland after I left it, I never became a citizen anywhere else or resident anywhere else. But with regard to your question, it's still a very popular undertaking, taking your money and run. And it's driven by uncertainty and annoyance with the cost of government in Canada. So yes, the book still sells. When you read it, it probably wasn't at the rate had it achieved 120,000 sales. It's now up over 200,000 sales, and I still get royalties on it. And what is happening, the way this works out, Gerry, is, and I've met a number of people who've read the book, a person leaves Canada, goes to the place they want to reside, and then takes up a profession, a job, a business, and they live happily ever after. There is not a driving. In my case, I came back after 15 years because I lost my job. I was a captain of a very, very attractive 43-foot ocean-going sailboat. After 15 years circling around the Mediterranean and crossing the Atlantic, the owner of the boat sold it, and I lost my job as captain. I almost divorced her for that.
Boy.
So anyway, we came back to Canada, and I continued to write. And, I was 65 years old. There wasn't a lot of thought of going back to work. I'd left all my assets offshore. But one of the things that Canadians should be looking at is the use of annuities. When I came back to Canada, I purchased an annuity because my income was guaranteed until death, as was my wife's. We had a very comfortable level of living, and the taxation was minimal, absolutely minimal. So with that sort of backdrop, if you came back to Canada after having run a hotel in Mexico, what you would do is get an annuity, kick back, and live happily ever after. But, again, speaking about the snowbirds, one of the people who took their money and ran as a result of that book, bought a hotel in, actually it's more of a B&B, in Puerto Vallarta. And she's more than happy there, running her business. And what I discovered when I went there was a significant Canadian community. So what your snowbird crowd should be looking at now is discovering Mexico. Again, Guadalupe has a very large Canadian community. So yes, people may take their money and run, but they can run someplace else as well as running home.
Yeah. Now, when you bought an annuity, were you outside of the country when you bought that annuity, or did you buy it through a brokerage service in Canada here, or was it purchased outside of the country?
No, I bought it through an agent at one of the insurance companies, and I was so cautious that I paid for it with a check, so that there was no money on deposit in Canada for to be able to pay the annuity company, because again, those books have not made me a friend of the state, and I am always worried about my assets and any income I may have with respect to any of the government agencies wanting to punish me for having, as one, at the time that you read the book, it was raised in the House of Parliament and said this by an MP, and said, this scoundrel has taken $2 billion of people's money out of Canada. So, that was back then. Can you match what the number is now? So anyway, I think for your snowbird crowd, they should look at other places, which I enjoyed Mexico immensely. It's the United States at 80% of the price.
So let me ask you this question. So we've got a Canadian who's worked, a Canadian person born in Canada, has moved to the States worked and lived in the States for the last 40 years on a green card. And they're thinking about this and they're listening to this podcast. Would you say that person who wants to come to Canada because of family, because of grandkids, healthcare, they want to come back to Canada? What would you tell those folks if they said, Alex, do I stay in the United States or do I come back to Canada? What would you tell those folks?
Well, having a green card, obviously, a gentleman or lady were employed in the U.S. They will have acquired an amount of retirement wealth, and they have an excellent opportunity of putting that wealth into a tax-shielded situation. And then I would, yes, advise them to come back to Canada, because we have a form of government which would be very difficult for a personality like Donald Trump to override. But you mentioned healthcare. One of the things that I regretted about coming back to Canada was giving up my healthcare. I'll give you an example. I had a package from private patients plan out of Tunbridge Wells, London. I was covered for $1.5 million of hospital care anywhere in the world except Japan and the United States. When I tore my Achilles tendon while visiting one of my sailing acquaintances in Florida, I was not covered for hospital care. So I flew to Toronto, went to Mount Sinai, slapped my card on the counter at the admissions, and said I had to go to emergency because I had a torn Achilles. They said, oh, right away, I'll call the doctor, because I was paying for it, cash. The doctor looked at the x-ray and said, "Oh my God, it's torn." He said, "You're going to have it replaced." I said, "How soon can you do that?" He said, "Waiting list is 6 months." I said, "I can't wait that long because I don't live here. I am a foreigner." "Oh, so you're a cash customer?" I said, "Yes." He took to his Rolodex. He said, "Could you come in on Thursday?"
Yeah. Unbelievable.
It really is.
So here's a question that's really off topic, but great segue. Canada has this public health care system, and I just talked to a doctor. I had lunch with a doctor yesterday out in White Rock, and I asked her for her opinion. Should we have private care in Canada? And this person was very favorable because it would really take a lot of stress off the public system,
Mm.
allow these wealthy people to pay for these procedures, like Alex's ruptured Achilles tendon that I believe you were playing tennis. Nowadays people play pickleball, and that's where they're rupturing all their tendons and breaking wrists and falling over and during their pickleball event. But do you think Canada would be a better place if we did have a private healthcare opportunity?
Well, your doctor friend hit the nail on the head. By having a pay-for parallel system, those rich scoundrels are going to leave a lot of places open for those poor, just get by folk to be able to get some health care. And, you know, if we continue with this kind of, what would you call it, imposition of only a public healthcare system, the next thing you know, we're going to prohibit people from buying Rolls Royces. At the guy who buys a Rolls Royce takes a lot of pressure off the public transportation system. He's not on the streetcars anymore. So, if you're going to allow people to spend their wealth on cars and other indulgences, why can they not have that same indulgence in the healthcare system?
Alex, I'll tell you another, I'll tell you another great story. And I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, but there's a, there's a person down in the States, ex advisor. He wrote a book called the IRA Millionaire. And the problem that these guys are running into with all this money in IRA and how it affects their Social Security benefits and how it's taxable or not. And they invited us to be on their podcast. And I said, between the two of us, in about 15 seconds, we were able to determine if we could intercept Canadians before they came home, 5 years before they came home, and they were using this backdoor Roth IRA strategy. I'm not sure if you ever heard of it, but it would allow them to have all their monies in a Roth, and they come back to Canada and they wouldn't be paying any tax on that Roth. So you talk about annuities being a great investment. This backdoor Roth strategy for Canadians, they come to Canada, you just file the election, and it's like money coming out of a TFSA. It wouldn't be taxable in Canada. And I'm sure that now that I'm connected to you and you're a felon of the CRA and all these cronies are going to be, rustled up and put into a room. I'm sure I'm going to be on that list now, but that would be a big chapter in your book, co-written by Gerry Scott, Take Your Money and Come Home. There's so many things that you can do in the States. And that leads me to my next question. If you had to look at the U.S. tax system and the Canadian tax system, what would you say is more favorable when it comes to acquiring wealth? Kind of a stupid question. I know where we're going with this.
That is difficult because I'm not that. Although I lived in the U.S. for 10 years, I wasn't at the stage where I had assets. And looking at the IRS, I know that the IRS has a lot more power than CRA. But the American system does have something similar to what we use in Canada. We use trusts to, usually foreign trusts, to store our wealth. They have a thing called foundations, which used to be set up in Panama. And there was an immense amount of U.S. offshore wealth in Panama until they started having this row over the canal. So yeah, the American system does have the same sort of escapes. And the systems are very similar, but the only difference is I think enforcement is a little more brutal in the U.S.
Well, I know that what we've dealt with, and we've had some great guests on our podcast that are very, very good on cross-border tax. In the United States, they have irrevocable trusts, which they use to avoid probate, and it's really just a look-through or a flow-through. But in Canada here, if we have that same vehicle, it's more of an entity, and there's a lot more issues dealing with it. And we know as soon as that U.S. person comes to Canada, they're part of an irrevocable trust, it becomes property of the CRA, and it's very, very difficult to manage these things. But you know, from my personal opinion, dealing with both Canadian tax and U.S. tax, I have to tell these younger generations if they have a chance to go to the States, and I know this administration is going to be difficult, but it sure seems like there's a lot of opportunities and things you can do in the States compared to Canada when it comes to acquiring wealth. So we used to see the border being crowded on both sides, Canadians going south and Americans coming up to Canada. And I think it is tilted now where a lot more Americans, or we'll call them snowbirds, selling their places, bringing those assets across the border. And these Canadians that had exited Canada are coming home as well too. And Americans that are marrying our beautiful Canadian women are coming up to Canada as well. So the border is busy, and I think the current administration is making it difficult for people to, not just Canadians coming home, but Americans, making it very, very difficult for them to understand what's going on down there. And there's so much news going on. I mean, I tell people be careful what you read, because now we used to watch the evening news. Now we can watch this all day long. And it's different. Is there anything else that you were, let's talk about a few of the books that you wrote outside of Take Your Money and Run. What were some of the other concerns that allowed you to write some great financial books in Canada?
Well, the other one, which is, again, a bestseller, is My Blue Haven. And what My Blue Haven is it's a manual for Canadians to be able to set up a structure outside of Canada where they can keep their wealth. And what it is, Gerry, is it describes a trust in somewhere like the Isle of Man, Jersey, wherever. And that trust is settled by someone, a lawyer. The beneficiaries are whoever you want. And there is a trust, and there is a trust company that administers the trust for a very minimal fee. And all of the income in the trust is tax-free. By common law, funds paid out of a trust are not taxable. In Canada, a trust itself is taxable at 35%, but the funds that come out go to the beneficiaries tax-free. So why pay that 35%? Have the trust outside of Canada, and everybody lives happily ever after. And it's also a very good inheritance vehicle. That book was followed by The Bond's Revenge, which showed that a bond portfolio over the long term will have only you'd only have to give up 0.75% for the security of having a bond portfolio. You'd make 0.75% more in an equity portfolio. The most amusing book of all was a book called Decommissioned. And I wrote about the hanky-panky, which is committed by the Ontario Securities Commission in their investigations. Well, the book was so insightful about how if you are an OSC agent, you have to do things in this way so as to not get found out. Now, the OSC couldn't go out and buy 120 copies of that, could they? So instead, they copied it illegally and circulated it to their staff as a manual. They have now offered to do a settlement of the what do you call those things?
Infringement?
The copyright violation. However, for me, it is more lucrative to be able to have this document to say, this is what I am the guy who teaches the OSC.
Now, you know, in your first, you said the other one that was a very good seller was creating this trust, and does this trust still exist today? But maybe CRA has bought all these 200,000 copies and just burnt them, so no one would could get that book in circulation. So maybe what you need to do is every other year print another 200,000 books and let CRA buy them and burn them as well. Now,
well, the other book I should mention, Gerry, is a book called Tackling the Taxman. And one of the most important revelations in that book is that when you become a tax auditor for Revenue Canada, you are like a policeman in that you are given that position for life. A policeman can stop serving, but he is still a policeman in perpetuity. A tax auditor can retire, but he's still an auditor in perpetuity. And one of the things that Revenue Canada is absolutely terrified of is a retired tax auditor, because he knows the whole inside workings. So I remember on one occasion, this company was about, a private company was about to be audited. And when the auditor arrived, CRA auditor, he said, the owner of the company said, you can speak to, I forget the chap's name. Anyway, you can speak to so-and-so, who is a retired CRA auditor, and he'll be handling your questions. The CRA auditor picked up his briefcase and walked away. And the company never did get audited. So anyway, Tackling the Taxman is, I think, of anybody who is suspicious that they may get into the gun sights of CRA should read that.
well, the last topic we'll cover, and I know that we have a new prime minister who's really talking about uniting Canada, the East and the West. I used to say that the only way you could ever unite this country is a good hockey game. Either the Toronto Maple Leafs are in the Stanley Cup Finals, or the Vancouver Canucks, or Winnipeg, Calgary, or Edmonton. What do you think of the current administration with Mark Carney taking over for the Liberal Party?
Well, at first I was concerned because he had no political background. He didn't have any experience in that kind of job. But what I've seen is that he's just become the CEO of another corporation. It's called Canada. I see that he's learned one thing about politics, and that is you always run a deficit. And that does concern me, because I would have thought that somebody with a banking background would realize that debts are either paid for by the borrower or through inflation. And, you know, let me quote you. The first mention of inflation, it was by Euripides in a play he wrote in 400 BC called the Frogs. And in 400 BC, the Athenians were fighting the Spartans over the Peloponnesian War. And it was costing a lot of money. The phrase comes out of the Frogs. Where is the silver drachma of old? And the recent gold coins, so clear stamped and worth their weight. Today, Athenian shoppers, through the known world they've ceased to circulate. Today, Athenian shoppers go to market with their pockets full of shoddy, silver-plated coppers. So to dilute the currency, what they did was they melted it down and copper-plated pennies to make them look like dollars. So, I am concerned that he isn't taking enough of his banking skills, which I appreciate, and applying them to this new company he's running.
It's from our perspective out here in Canada, it seems like the biggest thing that's been on their desk has been trying to manage the United States and how can we move forward after having such a great relationship on trade with them. So I'm really surprised because I know that Eastern Canada has been so liberal, and out here in the West we've been conservative. But I'll tell you, it's at the end of the day, we tried to look at the best resume that would lead us in the next decade, and a lot of my friends agreed that based on that resume, we sure hope we get a lot of those skills. Where he was a great, in my opinion, he did a great job with Bank of England and Bank of Canada during the day. So I hope he can use some of those skills to move this country forward, and more importantly, unite this country. I'm a little bit more excited about Canada than I had been, and I'm not a negative guy. I'm always going to be optimistic about anything and everything. But other than that, I think we've covered a lot of interesting things today. So you're telling people Canada is a good place to come home to? Would you agree that that's a good message we can send out to all those green card holders that are coming back to Canada?
Exactly. I know that a number of my friends who are employed or in business outside of Canada, if they are expats, they're residents someplace else, if they were to come back, I think the majority of them would come back to Canada. I looked at it, Gerry, and I thought, I've seen all these. I've been to Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and, I've seen some wonderful places. But when you get down to it, some of the best cities to live in are in Canada. So, all of those exotic places are quite attractive for the first 2 or 3 weeks. But when you live there for, 2 or 3 months, you realize that underneath the veneer, they're probably a lot uglier than you think they are. So yeah, I think I would advise anybody who is an expat today to park their money offshore, park their assets offshore, and come to Canada. And by the way, the second book, My Blue Haven, I originally pictured it as a book about tax avoidance. What I found was 70% of the people who set up these trusts offshore did it not for income reduction, but for asset protection. They were more worried about having their stuff stolen, either through the tax system or fraud or whatever, than they were about paying taxes.
Oh, it's interesting. But Alex, I really appreciate, and once again, you and I better get working on that book. Take your money and take your money and come home. We'll get started on that book, and I appreciate your time. It's always a kick I should have a big, long disclaimer that I'm not Alex's son and I'm no way connected to him financially, nor do I support all his interesting views. But anyhow, I appreciate your time and thank you very much.
Well, Gerry, it was a pleasure being here and having a chat with you. And I hope one thing that your viewers and listeners will take to heart is don't make the mistake I did, which is go to work for your wife. She fired me when I was 65.
Oh, if we lost everybody with the CRA, we just lost everybody else about the spouse. I'm an employee at home. I'm not in charge. I am an employee. My wife is in charge, and I'm sorry if I've given anybody any other belief that I was in charge. So thank you again. It's very entertaining, and I look forward to doing this again. Thank you again for listening to the Snowbird Expat Radio Podcast. The best way you can support the podcast is to forward the episode to a friend, and please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. Now, before you go, let me leave you with one of my favorite quotes. Be kind to all, the world is small.